All right, we're live.
Woo!
Welcome to the Footnotes podcast, where we do a deep dive into the details and footnotes of things we've been learning and thinking about from this week. By we, I mean me. I'm June. I'm going to be a medical student at McMaster University.
And me, Paul. I'm going to be a medical student at Western University.
Yeah, so we're supposed to be smart,
The-
but I'm not
yeah.
sure how I feel about that.
People at home can be the judge of that.
Yeah.
Well, why are we doing this, June? I think we said we wanted to keep in touch, right? That's the
Mhm.
main issue, like main reason. We've been friends for like
40.
40 years.
Mm-hmm.
At Mac, we both went to the same program. And we don't really want to stop having these wonderful conversations, and we want to keep the dialogue going. So we decided to make a podcast. Yeah, fun. So hopefully this takes off. I mean, it seems like it'll be a fun thing to do. It
Uh-huh.
might become work, as you might imagine, when we go into medical school and the classic going through the classic medical school experience where you're busy like every single day and you barely have time for anything else. Just study, study, study. But hopefully we'll be able to keep conversations going like this.
Yeah, I hope so.
Yeah.
Okay.
So what's been going on in your life, June? What's
So I moved to Hamilton into my beautiful, technologically sophisticated house.
wow.
The Google Home integrated sound system outside, inside the house,
Wow, what?
in every room. Sort of feels like, I don't know, is it in Fahrenheit 451 where you have like giant TV screens filling up every room? So that's sort of the world I'm in now.
Does it actually do something for you? Like what do you use it often, the Google Home?
I mean, yeah, I get it to like play music. I ask it about the weather, and yeah, I'm sure it can do more things as time goes on. But for now, it's a cool little gimmick to have. I'd say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, like you and I, we've been moving towards using voice functionality recently.
Yeah.
Like we're just sitting in our rooms going, "Okay, Google. Okay, Google. Okay, Google," and it can't even hear us. Um,
You might activate my Google.
oh my goodness. So it works fine, right?
Mm-hmm. It works fine. Um, Other than that, I've been trying to read. I've been trying to read up on changing my diet. I started a new book called The Master and His Emissary by
Mm,
Ian McGilchrist. He's a psychiatrist and like one of the leading brain researchers in the world.
mm.
And the sub headline, I guess, is The Divided Brain and the Making of the Western World. So that's like a pretty huge topic.
Yeah, that seems like a lot to take on in one book.
Yeah, it's supposedly it took, it's like a 15, 16 year culmination.
Wow.
Wow. Wow is right.
And you've been talking about wanting to write a book for some time as well.
I mean, like, hopefully I can get stuck enough into a question so that I'll be able to
Mm.
write. How many pages is this? Like 600 pages of very well researched and documented knowledge instead of
Right.
speculating about you know, everything.
Well, do you want to start with talking about that first? Because it sounds
Yeah.
pretty interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what have you been finding so far with the book?
I mean, so I've only read 2 chapters of it. I've been trying to take notes as I go and try to
Mm.
digest it as much as I can, but I'm not sure how well it's been working.
Mm-hmm.
But I'll give you a few tidbits from the book. So I'll start with a question. Why do you think we have two hemispheres?
Why do I think? Um, well, I sort of have an informed opinion about this.
Okay.
Some of the things I've heard, mainly from sources like Jordan Peterson.
Yeah.
But I understand that there's a need for the brain to carry out two sort of functions. One is to uh, take in the external world to perceive, I guess. And then the other function is to take that information that you gain from the external world and order it in a way that's understandable and usable. So, the classic left brain is responsible for logic, reason, the right brain for creativity. So maybe the right brain's more implicated in taking in information, while the left brain is responsible for organizing it and making sense of it. Something like that.
Yeah, I would agree with you on some parts, but not others. So
Okay.
So that was I think a good response. I think where the book would differ by saying that it's not that the right brain takes in information and the left brain processes it. They both take in information, but let's say they represent it or understand it in different ways. So the corpus callosum structure that's connecting the two brains?
Right.
What's interesting about that is as cortical size expands and as brains become more sophisticated, by comparing animal brains to more developed brains, you can actually see the proportion of connections between the two hemispheres decreasing.
The proportion, what do you mean?
So let's say in a rat's brain, the number of neurons, the corpus callosum, represent about 5% of total brain mass.
Right.
Compared to humans, where our outer cortex size is much greater, the corpus callosum, I don't know the exact values, but let's say that represents 10%, no, 1% of total brain mass, or the total number of neurons. So the number of connections between the two hemispheres is actually decreasing. So if you thought about it in the sense that, the right hemisphere takes in brand new information and then kind of transfers it to the other one, that wouldn't be entirely correct from what I've read.
Right.
So instead, what it seems to be doing is, they seem to be like two autonomous, independent systems.
Okay.
And the few connections that it does have between them are mostly inhibitory. They can inhibit the function of another. And you might ask, why do we need two fully autonomous brains? And I think the answer that the book gives is each of them are adapted to very different functions in the world that are both very necessary. And there's an idea of opponent processors.
Okay.
And I didn't really understand it until I thought about it in terms of the muscles. So the idea that the book writes about is a set of autonomous opponent processors gives it more finer control over the world.
Over the world, or the perception of the world,
or whatever functions it engages in.
Okay.
The two of them being autonomous and being in opposition together creates a greater degree of control. So how I conceptualize it is with your muscles, right? Like you have flexor muscles that do this, and then you have extenders that do that, right? The thing is, if you only had flexor muscles, the most you could do with your arms is
right.
But because we have extensor muscles that
They sort of temper the movement and
Right.
help control.
As this uncontracts, this one slowly contracts.
Right.
And so through opposing movement, they're able to achieve finer control.
Right.
So I'm not fully sure how that applies to the brain, but that gave me sort of a better idea as to why having two autonomous systems that work almost at odds with one another really helps.
Well, another concept of the book, underlined by the subtitle, is that it's the master and its emissary, right? That's what so does that part of the brain has a greater role than the other, or has, I guess, greater opposing functions as opposed to the other one, if you know what I mean?
Right. So in some ways, yes. I think the case, well, from the very beginning of the book that the book makes is that the right hemisphere is supposedly should be the master.
Okay.
The left hemisphere should be its faithful servant, its emissary. And I can get into more examples, but one example that the book did give is about how both hemispheres process attention. So this is going to be tricky to try to get it straight because I'm not sure if it's straight in my mind. But so when you look at a picture, let's say you look at a picture of a clock.
Okay.
Both brains are gonna process information favoring the visual field that they have access to. So the right hemisphere gets information from the left brain. So the left side is going to be favored, whereas the left hemisphere gets information from the right brain, from the right eyes.
Right.
This gets confusing. So it favors the right visual field.
Yeah.
So if you have a patient who had a stroke in their right hemisphere, so they're only relying on the left hemisphere, and you show them a picture of a clock, they'll draw a clock, and then they'll represent, all the hours on the right visual field. So they'll draw half a clock on the right side.
Yeah.
And then they won't be able to actually fill in any of the details on the left side. So what that shows is the left hemisphere is incapable of processing information that came from the opposite visual field. And in some patients, when they look at themselves in the mirror, patients with a right hemisphere stroke, then they will deny that. This is getting confusing. They will deny that one part of their body, either that they can't see it or that it doesn't exist. So if you only were depending on your left hemisphere and you only had access to the right visual field, people with that would actually deny that the left part of their body even exists.
Right.
The left hemisphere has a very kind of localized attention. But if a person had a stroke on their left hemisphere and only had access to their right hemisphere, gave them the same clock task, they could draw the whole clock.
Oh, interesting.
And what that shows is that the right hemisphere is able to still integrate information from the opposite visual field. And I'm not sure, technically, what the mechanisms behind that are.
Right.
And that was one example given from the book. So that's very specific example of how the right hemisphere displays a kind of global
Mm.
attention, and that is more broader in scope than the left hemisphere.
Mm-hmm.
And it also comes, the right hemisphere's way of seeing things, there's a hierarchy to our attention.
Mm-hmm.
So if you see the number 8,
Mm-hmm.
but you know, like imagine that the number 8 is colored in or filled in with all number 4s.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a bunch of number 4s comprising the number 8, the shape of the number 8.
Yeah.
When you see that, most people, like 99% of people, usually just see the number 8 first.
Mm-hmm.
So that kind of interpreting the whole comes
Guess.
first in our awareness.
Mm-hmm.
We don't see all the little 4s that are comprising the 8.
Mm-hmm.
We see that afterwards, and that kind of, well, attention to detail is a task that's handled by the left hemisphere.
Mm.
So that demonstrates that the attention of the right hemisphere comes to awareness first, then the attention of the left hemisphere. Something like that. So
Right.
I think I guess they are relevant, but I wish I could read on to find some more powerful examples, but those are some ways in which the right hemisphere has a kind of more overreaching influence
Mm-hmm.
than the left hemisphere.
Right. And that ties in with the title as well, right? So the master is the one that kind of oversees everything, and the emissary is the person that the master sends for specific tasks, for very specialized things that require attention. So
Right. That's a really interesting way of putting it. Like, that made me think about like a pyramid. So if you like, have one guy, the master at the top, that's overseeing everything, but on the level of the ground, there's his emissaries. So those are some of the things I've been like thinking about. Some more cool examples about divides between the left and the right. So the left hemisphere is responsible for that kind of local focused attention. So when predators are latching to like prey or familiar prey, they'll reach out with their right hands, like 99% of the time.
To the left. Okay.
Which refers to the left hemisphere.
Right.
And when chicks or most other animals, they are detecting prey or predators, threats, external threats, they actually track most of their movements using their left eye, which is their right hemisphere. So it seems that the global kind of seeing the whole kind of attention system developed by the right hemisphere is useful for detecting prey or detecting predators. I'm really mixing this up. Detecting predators in the area, or trying to discriminate whether something, in your periphery is a friend or a foe,
right,
and that kind of response. So that's the most I can talk about this book at the moment.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah,
I just want to jump in and say that seems pretty compatible with some of the research that's been already done in terms of what the left brain and the right brain is responsible for, right? So the classic example that I gave in the very beginning, that the left brain is responsible for logic and reason, while the right brain is more so like creativity. When you're trying to be creative, you have to take into account many ideas at once, and you make various connections, and you see things as a whole. Usually, it's easier to be creative that way. And when you're trying to reason or to use logic, then it's easier to be very specific and to hone your attention on very specific details to figure out the order of things. So I think that's actually quite consistent with what's been done. Maybe the idea of it being more centered on attention is something that's new that people haven't really been focusing on. They would just say, oh, logic, creativity.
The reason I've been focused on attention is because I think the first chapter and the second chapter mostly talked about attention.
Oh, okay. Well, there you go.
There might be much more, yeah.
Okay, so
but with what you said, what's interesting is, yeah, I think what you said is right, and what you said might also be responsible for the tip of the tongue phenomenon. So in order to formulate like a word that fits the situation, that's sort of like a right hemisphere function. Trying to understand the context and where in your memory, when, in what context and when and where did you learn that word. So when you have a word at the tip of your tongue, that's kind of the process you would be needing. But once you start focusing on that question, like, oh, what was that word? Like, I just can't remember it. Then you're shifting over to the left hemisphere, kind of focus, narrow thinking, and inhibiting the right hemisphere. So you can't really come up with that word. And then when you stop trying and you just, go off, it'll just suddenly come to you. Because that inhibition by the left hemisphere has been dissolved.
Interesting.
So the book says that process might be what causes the tip of the tongue phenomenon.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
I'd like to tie this in with something that's been going on in my life, if you don't mind. So every Tuesdays I have a musical thing that I go to, and the basic premise is we practice. We all have our solo performance, and we rehearse it every week, and then we have a final performance at the end. But the focus that I want to take is how to deliver a good performance. And the reason why what you're talking about sort of ties in is I've been grappling with this for a while to think about, what sort of processes, what kind of thoughts that I can have would help me deliver a better performance. So I found that when I'm less focused on singing the individual notes, when I'm less focused on saying the words, I can deliver a better performance. I feel more emotionally present. I feel more engaged with what I'm doing. So when I take a step back and sort of feel the song, so as to say, instead of thinking about performing it, then I do a lot better than had I focused on each of the words and saying everything correctly. And this has been pretty consistent too. Every week I've been trying different approaches, and the best way seems to be, just to be natural, act naturally. So I'm wondering, because, it's great to understand like how the brain works, the left and right brain. I'm also interested in applicability, and I'm actually very excited to see where this sort of research takes us and what sort of applications might come out of this. And, musical theater is obviously not the most important application to a lot of people, especially in the science community. But that's something that I've noticed is actually very helpful, is learning how the brain works actually helps you with the performance, because, it gets your mind in the right zone to perform. If that makes sense.
I mean, when you're preparing for the performance, how do you prepare?
Right. So this is another point too. I sort of just sit there and I think about the song, and I just allow all of the emotions and memories that are associated with it not overwhelm me, but take me. Like, I just imagine everything at once.
All right.
And that sort of develops, let's say, a holistic experience for me that I can then present to the audience.
But how about the specific words and like how you're going to sing the notes?
So that comes out when I actually go and perform. So every performance actually ends up being quite different, depending on to the extent to which I'm able to engage with the various experiences, and emotions that I bring up and think about.
Mhm. So you think that more holistic approach, really allowing yourself to feel all the associations and memories and emotions you have with that piece,
Mm-hmm.
really helps the performance.
Yeah, it's, how do you say it? It's more holistic.
Yeah.
It's as though I'm feeling it from in my whole body, as opposed to just in my mind, or just in my face, like as in terms of my expressions. It really, it's overtaking.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
You're possessed by the music.
really, honestly, yeah. That might have to do
Yeah.
with how the brain works. I'm trying to make a connection there, but
Yeah. I'm not sure.
hopefully the research gets to a point where we're able to apply these things to arts and to these less appreciated,
Mhm.
less research maybe fields.
I mean, it seems like there's plenty of research. I just gotta keep reading.
That's true. That's
Yeah.
true.
But in terms of the performance thing, like performance is something I've struggled with like for a long time, like
Mm-hmm.
violin. I got really into violin probably around grade 7, grade 8. So throughout high school, I when I finished school, I went to my violin teacher's house and I practiced violin for like 2 or 3 hours every day.
Mm-hmm.
And I would really try to get into the nitty gritty of, all the fingers and whether I was playing the right note on each of the notes.
Right.
And I think something that I lacked was that ability to kind of feel or intuit the piece and what it meant and what kind of associations it had like for me.
Mm-hmm.
So I think I was mostly just focusing on the technical aspect.
Right.
Oh, I should play this loud because it says forte on that bar.
Mm-hmm.
Or when I had a passage that was like very difficult, um, I would constantly stress over it, and I try to practice it, 10, 20, 100 times to get over the hump.
Right.
So I think, like, thinking about that, I think I was too narrowly focused on the technical aspects,
Mm-hmm.
which in the end might not be the most important factor for a good performance.
Right. Well, it's definitely important, and
Mm-hmm.
maybe that's what makes it so hard to deliver a great performance. Is that, again, there's this balance, right? There's technique, and I like the word you used there, intuition.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like the dance between the left and the right brain again.
Right.
If the left brain is technique, then the right brain is this intuitive, holistic uh,
Mm-hmm.
view.
Yeah. But the thing is that you need the technique to kind of refine and, well, yeah, refine the image, the picture that you're trying to paint. And
Mm-hmm.
like that, those kind of details are what separates, like, my creative drawings from, like, I don't know, a masterpiece or
Right.
Leonardo da Vinci. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I can see where the details really matter, but I think when you're starting to perform and when it's to like an audience that isn't super critical
Mm-hmm.
of the highest level of detail, then I think that right hemisphere like feeling is it's more important. It takes precedence.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So.
Well, here's a question.
Uh,
So it seems like we can train technique.
mhm.
Can we train intuition?
Can we train intuition? Can we train musicality?
Yeah, or just broadly, can we train that sort of holistic view? That can we train the right brain as opposed to the left brain? I wonder. I wonder if it's just practice. You know,
Mm-hmm.
like I can personally say that I've gained a lot of experience performing over 4 years, and it's gotten a lot easier to get in that mindset of performing because now I'm used to letting the experiences and memories and emotions come in, and not focus on the nitty gritty. But
Mm-hmm.
at the same time, throughout the 4 years, I've been learning how to vocal techniques and how to sing better and breath support and things like that. So
Mm-hmm.
it seems like it's harder to measure maybe the training
Mm-hmm.
of the right side.
Right. In terms of training, see, what I'm having difficulty is I think when you mention training, the
Mm-hmm.
idea is that it can get better and better and better and better, and there's no upper limits to how holistic and creative a person can be.
Right.
But I think just coming from like that violin background,
Mm-hmm.
you can see like very dramatic differences in a person's ability to interpret musical works or really be engaged and deliver a compelling performance.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's different upper limits to people's abilities to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So I think training is possible, but to an extent, and
Some of
maybe
it's innate.
some of it is.
Innate.
Yes, yeah. There's definitely a innate potential, talent kind of issue there. But I do agree that it can be. The word I would use is disinhibited.
Okay. Interesting.
So I think one of the bigger cases that the book makes is that the left hemisphere has sort of become a tyrant over the right. So the
Mm-hmm.
left hemisphere, in its preference towards things that are predictable, things that whose outcome we can calculate, things that we can break down
Mm-hmm.
analytically and build up again. So that has taken a strong preference within our education system, within our world, to the holistic abilities of the right hemispheres.
Mm-hmm.
So we've kind of lost touch with it. The story he cites is something written by Nietzsche. So Nietzsche, in one of his books, there was this really wise and benevolent ruler of the kingdoms. And so wherever he ruled or governed, the population grew and prospered until it got to a scale where he knew he couldn't govern them all by himself.
Mm-hmm.
So he sent out emissaries, to kind of look over the regions.
Mm-hmm.
But one of his emissaries, who was one of the most talented and one of the most skilled, decided to overturn the wise and benevolent ruler. Um, the motivation, I think, was a little bit of contempt, the idea that I could do it better.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually, all the lands became a tyranny and full of misery and suffering.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the kind of story that Ian Milkechrist says mirrors the Western world, the history of the Western world.
Uh-huh.
So to that extent, assuming that that story is somewhat true, I think that we, having grown up in this Western world, uh, have a preference for our left hemispheres,
Mm-hmm.
and it inhibiting the kind of feeling, intuiting, um, and holistic aspects of the right hemisphere way of viewing the world.
Right.
So to the extent that that inhibition can be disinhibited, I think that our innate abilities to feel things and to see things in their whole can be expressed more.
Hmm.
Yeah. So that's what I would say about that.
That's very interesting. I, I, I'm taking it all in, honestly, and um, it resonates with me a lot, and I think it's sort of the movement of this generation, perhaps.
Hmm.
Well, as we get out of the age of reason, we
Hmm.
sort of go back to um, what is the opposite of reason, really? I don't even know, but
Hmm.
um, emotion. I don't know. TOK tells me it would be like emotion or something.
Hmm.
But it's the sense that it's a revitalization of art and of creativity and going away from the mechanized view of the human body and the human brain, and
Hmm.
realizing that it creates a holistic whole. It creates there are eminent properties that create something greater than its component parts. So it seems to be very much in line with where we're heading, and I'm definitely a fan of it. If you couldn't already tell.
You're a fan of the. You're a, yeah, supporter of the arts.
Yes,
And
big fan, big fan.
me too.
There
I guess that's why we're friends.
you go.
Very well.
Um, well,
What
I
else?
kind of want to move on to talking about some diets, some nutrition,
Diets, nutrition.
if you don't mind. Yeah.
That's a big topic change. Have you been looking into nutrition, diet?
Well, yes, a little bit. So I
Little.
can tell you a bit of what I've been doing. Um, so I've been very much interested in this low fat diet, low fat, low carb, high protein diet.
All right.
You'd imagine, it's for building muscle. It's for
Okay.
looking more aesthetic. Blah blah
Right.
blah blah.
Uh-huh.
Um, but the toughest part that I think I've found is finding good sources
Hmm.
and then learning to trust sources um, to actually follow and to trust, I guess.
Hmm.
Um, because there's so many varying perspectives in the topic of nutrition, and obviously research in nutrition is also heavily influenced by those who fund it. Those who fund it are whoever wants to sell their nutritional products.
Hmm.
Uh, but for me, I've been taking sort of a case study approach. I'm
Right.
trying different things, seeing how they affect me.
Hmm.
So right now, I'm just trying to get as much protein in my body as humanly possible, just in a natural way. I haven't taken any supplements or anything like that,
Hmm.
and trying to reduce my fats. And in fact, it's actually been, um, it's had good effects. Uh, Mostly mental, actually. I've noticed that I feel lighter,
Right.
as they always say, but I also feel more clear in the mind. I guess like I spend less energy trying to break down like fats and difficult to break down metabolites, I guess, or
Hmm.
whatever. But yeah, I'm still trying. I'm still looking into it. I know that you've been interested in the ketogenic diet.
Hmm.
Um, not I'm not very keen on it. I don't know what your
Hmm.
experience or research has shown, but
Yeah.
it seems scary. I don't know.
Before I get into that, I just want to make a comment on
Sure.
your methodology.
Hmm.
So yeah, you're right. There are a lot of nutritional studies, many of them motivated by who knows what.
Hmm.
And it seems as though you can find a study supporting almost any diet that that you.
Yes. Yeah.
So it is very confusing, and I actually do like the approach that you're taking,
Mm.
with, well, as the case study, and seeing how it feels for you, because I think people, this is back to the whole left and right, argument, or that idea. We've had this strong preference for, quantitative results, randomized
Mhm.
controlled trials, and isolate one variable and beat it with the stick with, high sample size, and all these, great techniques to try to find out the truth of whether this diet helps
Mhm.
in reducing LDL cholesterol,
Right.
or men between the ages of 50 and 80. Well, I appreciate those endeavors and all. I think that the case study and subjective approach is actually very powerful because um, one of the things that we have towards our own subjective experiences is we have multiple senses, right? So
Mm-hmm.
commonly it says that we have five, but we have more than that. Um, so we can taste the food we eat. We feel how that goes through our body and makes us feel at that point, 30 minutes from that point, an hour from that point. We can see visually whether there's any apparent changes in our bodies.
Mm-hmm.
And there's many ways of trying to know what effect a change in your life is having on your body and
Mm-hmm.
on your life. And the thing is that you have multiple ways of confirming whether what you think is true.
Mm-hmm.
And well, the problem, with bias is that if you want something to be true, then you're more likely to believe that it's helping you, or there are problems there.
Mm-hmm.
But sort of what I've been thinking about is it's similar with meditation and being aware of your senses and whether they're being biased or influenced. So let's imagine that you can come to this like peak enlightened state where you have complete mastery and you're fully connected to all your senses and
Mm-hmm.
fully embodied kind of enlightened being. And then well, you can be like a really powerful adjudicator or scientist towards like what is happening in your body as you consume something. Or
Right.
yeah, so that's my little tangent, but I think that is that has the possibility to be a really great methodology.
I think it is a great methodology.
Yeah.
Also, like in addition to being able to, I guess, get all this different sorts of data
Yeah.
from different sources within yourself, um, it's also highly individualized, right?
Hmm.
What seems to be lacking in a lot of studies, of course, is that you get a mean, you get an average of the results, but you don't get individual results. So yeah, so living out your own experiment is probably a very powerful tool, especially actually also because there's not a lot of research in Asians, are there? Or I guess there would be in studies of other populations,
You're
but
right.
yeah, the main studies that I've been looking at are probably with white males, 20 to 35 or something. Um, so I don't know. Maybe because we're Asian, we'll have different benefits to different diets. But
Yeah. So that's the kind of approach that I've been trying to take
mhm,
or I hope to take, is to see what kind of effect diets have on me. Of
mhm,
course, it's difficult. I think I think of it as being like a qualitative researcher, but with self-reports.
right.
And if you're not let's say, fully balanced and regulated and attentive person, let's say, then
Mhm,
you can easily miss your data sources, scramble them up, and interpret them in ways that maybe aren't the most valid. So,
right.
but maybe the counter, well, position to take for
Mhm,
the individual data sensing method would be to see if basic science can support what you feel from the diet.
mhm.
Maybe
That's
that's an extension of our senses. Our we can use our intellect to try to uh, knock out if what we're thinking is valid or feeling is valid.
mhm, mhm,
So, in terms of what my intellect has learned about the ketogenic diet, the analogy is something like this. So, imagine that it's the 1940s, 50s, where cars are newly coming into the mainstream.
Okay.
And this like genius inventor, his name is Bill. He invents a hybrid car, the first hybrid car, and it's a beautiful machine. And he said the instructions basically are, all right, to fuel this vehicle, you should run it mostly on electricity. When available, you can put some gasoline in and it'll fuel the car fine. But as people started to use it, they just started relying more and more and more on gasoline. And they found that the car just kept breaking down. Year after year, the car breaks down and they run to Bill with the complaints and, hey, what's up? Like, my car's breaking down. And Bill's like, well, I told you to use electricity most of the time, but you're fueling it with the wrong thing half the time. And eventually, no one listens to Bill. The cars all break down and they don't sell anymore. So Bill goes out of business. So that's the hypothetical story, but that's the analogy that I've seen one YouTuber make to what's happening with our modern bodies. So if I can make some links in the analogy for you, the gasoline, that kind of highly concentrated energy source would be, the carbohydrates that are so abundant in the modern world. Really highly refined sugars and grains in quantities that we've never had before in human history, and fruits and vegetables that are kind of that we evolved to suit our own tastes. To be the sweetest, freakish, most mutant forms possible. And I think the case that could be made is that for most of our history, our bodies have most optimally adapted to another fuel source, which is in the form of mobilizing the fat in our body to use as energy. So that's the premise behind the ketogenic diet, because how ketones are produced is that when the body doesn't get, let's say, food for a long enough time, or a source of carbohydrates, it'll first start using the glycogen stores in your muscles and your liver. I guess basically like chains of glucose that it has in the body. And it'll use that up, and it'll take around 10 to 12 hours to deplete those stores. And after that, it'll start mobilizing the fats, the adipose tissue throughout your body. It'll break them down into fatty acids, release them into the bloodstream. It gets to the liver, where they're further broken down into something called ketones. And ketones can also be used as energy source, analogous, let's say, to the electricity that are supposedly our brains and our bodies can use more efficiently than glucose. And I do think that there is a little bit of evidence to support that model. It seems that ketones have a beneficial effect for your brain. So ketones apparently upregulate the level of something called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, helps brain neuron synapse formation and repair and things like that. Also related is it supposedly lowers the GABAergic tone of the brain.
So the inhibitory
raises the GABAergic tone and lowers the glutamatergic tone. So raising the inhibitory tone of the brain and lowering the excitatory tone. And that there are a few studies on conditions like epilepsy and autism where ketogenic diets have shown a benefit towards those. So like from an evolutionary point of view, I think that makes some sense to me. It makes sense to me that we're not exactly fully adapted to these carbohydrate-rich diets. That for most of our history, um, we were basically starving and ate food when we could find them after a successful hunt.
Right.
But otherwise, we were running on whatever we had in our body. So trying to apply that to modern life, the kind of formula for the ketogenic diet is your diet should consist of 75% fats.
Oh, wow.
Around 20% protein, 5% carbohydrates. And carbohydrates from like dark leafy greens and those kind of sources.
So no rice.
No rice, yeah. But that's on the standard formulaic version. There's also other variations that can that involve things like intermittent fasting, only eating in a daily window of 4 to 6 hours in a day, and not eating for the rest. Where I guess rice could be permitted, but in smaller amounts.
One thing I want to mention is, so the evolutionary perspective on nutrition. It's a bit troubling to me because it sort of assumes that we were in a perfect state before we got to the modern world, and that evolution isn't still occurring in a sense. So who's to say that we're not adapting now to a high sugar diet or a high carb diet, and that people who do eat that actually will become more successful because that's one of the more, I guess, available foods, or more available foods in the current society. And also that diet seems like it's not very promotive of let's say bodybuilding or making gains. It seems to be more so improving brain function, regulating mood, maybe, and things like that. So
I'll address the first concern, which is about how do we know that we're not adapting to this new carbohydrate dense diet. And I guess if you give it a long enough evolutionary time frame, you might see certain proportion of individuals who successfully adapted to this diet, and they get selected more, and then things like that. But I think that kind of the cultural narrative or the evidence that I've seen is that we are not adapting terribly well to this new influx of carbohydrates.
Right.
So one example is the real rise of something called metabolic syndrome and all its affiliated diseases, so obesity, type 2 diabetes, and other metabolic concerns. And that, at least in a big part, seems to be due to our overconsumption of refined carbohydrates. Sugar, high fructose corn syrup, more specifically. One might be another counter example. Can you think of any? I've lost my train of thought.
Well, I just want to jump in and maybe say that this is going to be a very, very troublesome perspective. But that's part of what natural selection is. And what I mean by that is I'm sure that some people who take these high carb diets are perfectly fine, and in fact are probably healthy. Is that not true? Is it that all people who are taking high carb diets or who are like ingesting a lot of carbs are experiencing things like obesity and other nutrition related disorders? Do we know?
I'm not sure about whether if we're just talking about in general carbohydrates.
Yeah.
I think there would be examples of people were tribes who are adapted to higher carbohydrate diets based on the availability in their environment. But the kind of like refined sugars that we see in our diets, I think that's something that we are like not adapted to at the most fundamental level. So the example that I was trying to think about that I kind of lost my train of thought on was our microbiota. So another article I read a few weeks earlier was about how we're losing the diversity in our microbiota. And there's, well, the journalist tracked the story of one researcher who's been investigating the kind of nutrients that allow, the kind of diets that allow healthy microbiota to flourish. And one of the key, I guess, ingredients to a healthy microbiota seem to be ingesting more complex fiber sources. And that seemed to be giving, quote unquote, more work to a niche pocket of bacteria that would break down those fibers and try to process nutrients from them. But the concern that the researcher had was that because we have this influx of readily available sugar sources, carbs that require little to no fiber processing at all when ingesting, that those bacteria have been completely eliminated from most Western populations. So when that researcher went to indigenous tribes, the Amazons, and profiled their microbiota, they just saw all these bacteria that they hadn't seen before in their laboratories, because they've been basically wiped out from the samples that they've been getting that they thought was the normal in the Western population. So I think that's maybe another example of that, and the rising incidence of things like asthma and a lot of different environmental inflammatory conditions. One hypothesis about why that's happening is that we're losing the bacteria that used to be in our guts that would kind of prime and calibrate our immune systems to be adequately responsive to threats. And to better differentiate between what is a threat and what is not. We're sort of losing that as partly a function of our diets. So I think those examples can illustrate that refined carbohydrates, it is very difficult to adapt to them. Even our let's say microbiota that have been around here for billions of years, and them forming symbiotic relationship with mammals, like it can't even sustain that. So I think there is a deeper problem with the diet that we have to.
It's like eating poison. Like you'll never get it. You'll never get adapted to eating poison, really.
Yes. Yeah.
So, interesting.
So, you know, I think that's a pretty easy and compelling case to make about sugar and refined carbohydrate. I guess. Right. What was the second point you were making? I also wanted to address that. So the first was the
gains.
Oh, and for the gains, I've read that there have been some studies, so this is secondary reading and not primary study reading, that ketogenic diets and ketones in the bloodstream also upregulate hormone growth, human growth hormone in the bloodstream. So that can contribute to muscle growth.
But if there's no protein,
sufficient calories, and you're still getting protein sources.
Right.
20% of your diet according to the standard formula should be. So if you're still getting a surplus of calories with your ketogenic diet, then bodybuilding and gains should also be, it may be beneficial still.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And the types of fat. So last question, maybe. What are the types of fat that you can have? Because there's
Right.
also the concern there, right?
Right. So I've also tried to look a little bit into the history of, we've generally had a war on fats. So I think in America in around 1910, 1920, one of their presidents died of a heart attack. I think it was Eisenhower.
Okay.
Or I might be, someone died of a heart attack. And also at that time, there was a growing incidence of heart disease in the population. And when they were trying to single out a factor, the logical thing that they found, well, one of the studies found that there was fat accumulating and clogging the arteries of people with heart disease. And so the logical solution seemed to be to limit the amount of fats in our diet. Or that supposedly we used a lot of butter, a lot of animal fats in our cooking. But after that, we made the move into mass production of things like vegetable oils, canola oils, where those kind of butter animal fats are saturated fats. So they're straight chain and they stack on top of
really well.
Very well. What we started consuming more and more is unsaturated fats, so not fully saturated with hydrogen. So there's kinks, the fatty chains. So I thought it was really interesting how things I learned in grade 11 finally clicked in applicability. So there are some hypotheses saying that that might be the reason why incidence in heart disease and things like that have kind of been on the upward rise, and that had we stuck to our high saturated fat diets, would have lower incidence of heart disease. That seems to be supported. I saw the results of one study where they plotted all the countries and their kind of prevalence of heart disease, and the other axis was whether they had a diet that was primarily centered around saturated fats, lots of fatty foods. So that's also known as the French paradox. The French people love to use lots of fats and buttery creations like foie gras, like liver, fatty, and they dump more butter and fat, and they eat that, and they still have lower incidence of heart disease than Americans. So when they plotted the countries, they saw a general downward correlation. If you had countries that consume more saturated fats in their diets, they actually had lower incidence of heart disease.
Really?
So we might have chosen the wrong scapegoat in our concern about, in our reaction to heart disease.
Right.
And there's also some, kind of conspiracies that are quite substantiated now, that the sugar industry backed a lot of research to kind of demonize fats and promote their products as not being the cause of obesity and not being the cause of heart disease and things like that. So I think that we should be having more saturated fats in our diets as opposed to trans fats and those artificial unsaturated.
Have you been following the ketogenic diet? Like, is that what's been happening this week? No?
I mean, the plan has been to transition into it.
Okay.
So I've been consciously trying to reduce the amount of carbs in my diet.
But you
Which
love rice.
I love rice, and I did have like maybe like a fifth of the plate of rice today, with a lot of greens and a big buttery hunk of salmon.
Nice.
So I still do think I can get my rice. I did fail terribly on Saturday night when I had 2 beers and like a full bag of chips.
Yep.
So, yeah, that's like not good. But my plan has been to transition into it. So I wanted to make a meal plan for a week and then try to follow that for 1 week. And I'm not sure if that will be the coming week or the week after.
Okay.
So I will try and see where that goes. I'll report on my 5 senses.
Please do.
Mm-hmm.
Case report by next week.
Yeah. I want to do one more footnote. Do you have time for one more footnote?
Yeah.
I feel like I've been talking too much. Do you have a footnote? Anything best from your life?
So do you mean like one footnote each?
Yeah.
I do have a footnote. This is a very recent footnote. So this morning I went golfing with my parents. So I'll explain the day. I woke up at 4:45, which wasn't actually as bad as I thought. I think I'm getting more used to sleep deprivation, which is good for medical school. It's gonna be good. It's a useful skill. But yeah, I woke up, went to Morton's, got food, and then hit up the golf course by about 6:45, and we played until 11. We went super early because it's like 30 degrees now, 35. Yeah. It's too hot. You got to go in the morning.
Yeah.
So this is the first game I played this year, and I don't know if you know, but I played in high school as a part of a team.
Yeah.
And since then, I have not been keeping up, have not been practicing. So today was a tough day. Big L's here and there. Got to be honest. But as per usual, I always do poorly in the beginning. Then I go to the depths of hell.
All right. Oh, Paul has disconnected. Paul, I can't see you. Paul. What happened
there? I'm back.
You're back.
So is okay. Sorry. As I was saying, my trajectory.
Yeah.
I do really poorly. I go to the depths of hell, do incredibly terribly.
All right.
And then I always have a rebound, rebirth.
Right.
A second coming.
All right. The second coming.
Yes. And what usually, I guess, causes that second coming. Well, what causes the descent is that I just get increasingly frustrated with myself, and I start swinging harder, and I stop worrying about form, and I start to
force it.
Force it and hate myself, and then I give up. I'm like, you know what, this game, it's good. I'm all good, and that's when things start to improve again, and a couple of things happen. I start to relax. I start to go with the flow. I don't hit as hard. I don't swing as hard. And I start to think more clearly because now, there are no stakes. Like I'm not worried about my score. I already gave up on doing a good game, a perfect game,
Uh-huh.
and I start learning and I start improving. And by the end of it, by around like this 15th, 16th hole, I'm like, I'm ready to play another 18 holes. Like give me another round of golf. Like
All
this
right.
is where I need to be. I'm in the best place that I can be.
Uh-huh.
And then I have to go home. Um, so I guess like this, because it's a recurring theme, you'd think I'd learn something from it. But every time I go and play golf, it's always the same trajectory. But I think it's a good lesson about life. And
Uh-huh.
people and old people love to extrapolate golf to life. And I've sort of picked up on that, I think. Um, the fact that you're there, you're playing with nature. You're not playing against it. You're hitting the ball onto the green. You're not trying to
Uh-huh.
really push or like destroy that ball, massacre that ball. Um, so this is a big footnote of mine for this week: is lessons from sports, lessons from athletics. I'm sure it actually probably extrapolates to other sports as well. If you try to force it too much, things don't always work out. But
Mhm.
if you trust yourself and go with it, then things can go well.
Yeah, so that reminded me of a verse from the Tao Te Ching, which is a short book by this ancient Chinese sage guy called Lao Tzu.
Right.
And I really like this verse. Let me read it to you. Verse 8. The best way to live is to be like water, for water benefits all things and goes against none of them. It provides for all people and even cleanses those places a man is loath to go. In this way, it is just like Tao, or the way.
Mm-hmm.
Live in accordance with the nature of things. Build your house on solid ground. Keep your mind still. When giving, be kind. When speaking, be truthful. When ruling, be just. When working, be one-pointed. When acting, remember, timing is everything. One who lives in accordance with nature does not go against the way of things. He moves in harmony with the present moment, always knowing the truth of just what to do.
Wow.
So, yeah, so I think you learned how to be like water, how to go with the flow.
Yeah, and
And
I learn it every game. I learn it.
you're right. And I think, I mean, this is a topic like, I've been thinking about a lot. I think about generally.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the biggest indications that like you've let go and are, going with the flow of things is that you're having fun.
Mm.
And I I didn't hear you explicitly say it, but I think you did have fun when you started relaxing and
Yeah.
performing better, and things like that. So that's also something I've heard a lot in basketball while watching basketball. So sometimes teams, they or players, you can see them trying too hard. They force their shots and
Mm.
they try to play harder instead of having fun and doing what they can and trying to help the team win.
Right.
In the timeouts, I always heard the coaches say, just, hey man, relax, play your game.
Mm.
Just trust what you can do and let the ball go and find the open man and things like that. So I do think that being able to let go and not force things too much and not be too concerned about. Yeah, the strange paradox is the more you start to care about
Mm.
something you want to get better at, the less you get better at it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it seems like there needs to be a certain level of detachment
Mm.
from that. Um, Maybe that's what caused my one chip bag eating spree. Just too caught up on like the ketogenic diet and how it's supposed to be the best thing in the world. Uh,
Mm.
but maybe I should let go a little bit and try to have a little bit.
Have fun.
Yeah. And in the end, that's what ends up benefiting me more.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Left brain, right brain. Sort of goes back to that as well, doesn't it?
How so?
I guess I would say the right brain, taking a holistic view,
Mm-hmm.
is, you know, um, focusing less on the details,
Mm-hmm.
not directing your attention so much onto one or two outcomes,
Mm-hmm.
stepping back a little more.
Right.
Of course, with that, there's the caveat that there's a balance. You can't just be laissez-faire all the time.
Yeah.
Otherwise, nothing happens. But there's a good balance there somewhere.
Yeah, like the problem with focusing too much on one goal or outcome is that you start to neglect the other factors in your life that also contribute to, the betterment of that outcome you're focusing on.
Right.
So, which is like a really strange problem, and like you can't really wrap your head around that.
No.
Yeah, so it's hard, but maybe this is like a naive perspective, but the best indication that you're doing something right and that you're moving towards the best possible outcome in all the outcomes that you wish for is
Mm-hmm.
that sense of fun and engagement and meaning.
Mm-hmm.
So
I think I don't know if you told me this, but I love the saying, "You should dance through life."
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
that's one of my goals after a particularly profound experience of mine. Is that thinking that I want to live my life as though like I'm dancing through it,
Mm-hmm.
and not in like a crazy manic like way, but just
No, with finesse.
with finesse,
Yeah.
some choreography, but improvisation and
Right.
incorporating other people, and it should be like a dance.
Mm.
But I'm a terrible dancer, so. But
You're getting better.
I can get, yeah, I'm getting better.
Did you
So,
have one more thing that you wanted to talk about?
oh yeah. So on this I actually saw 2 weeks ago.
Okay.
It's a video by Jonathan Pajot,
Okay.
the Eastern Orthodox Christian icon carver.
Icon carver.
Right. So he makes all the iconography that you see in like churches, all the like
Mm.
the kind of artwork that's like carved into wood, into stone, painted on the walls, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And he makes videos about symbolism in like movies, popular media, and kind of that symbolic world.
Mm-hmm.
And he released a video on, well, it was Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy. The title was, I think, Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy are real.
Okay.
And you might wonder, like, real in what sense?
Right.
To answer that question, like, I'll tell a story that he told in his video. Let me try to bring it up and remember better. So Jonathan has a daughter,
Mm-hmm.
and he used to play the Tooth Fairy game with his daughter. So every time like her tooth falls out, he hides $1 or $2 under her pillow, and then when she wakes up, she's like, "Oh, Daddy, the Tooth Fairy gave me $3 for my tooth."
Right.
And this went on until they were 6 and 7. But then one day, like Jonathan made a mistake without really realizing it. So his daughter had like mentioned to Jonathan that, "Oh, Daddy, I think like my tooth is about to fall out." And I think kind of on the side, Jonathan mentioned like, "Oh, I guess I got to like get $1 to ready." Ha ha ha. And then he looked at his daughter,
Yeah.
and then his daughter just like was in shock, like, "Wait, so like the tooth fairy wasn't real? Like it was you that was doing it all the time?" And then Jonathan was like, he was a little surprised at first because he thought his daughter would be old enough to know by now. But he asked his daughter a question. So, Jonathan was like, so why do you think I put the coins under your bed? And then his daughter was like, oh, because of the tooth fairy? And then Jonathan asked her, so what you're saying is the tooth fairy is making me put coins under your bed every time your tooth falls out. And then his daughter was like, yeah, the tooth fairy is making you do that.
Hmm.
And then, some that conflict was resolved within her.
Right.
And she was happy again. She wasn't sad anymore. She
Mhm.
wasn't destroyed. And what I found interesting about that was, in some sense, like, the tooth fairy is making Jonathan do that. Like, why
Right.
do grown men, who obviously, like, for the most part, don't believe in fairy tales, like, all play along with this collective game of putting like a dollar or two um, in someone's pillow? And it's
Oh, is this a question?
yeah, it's like, I guess it's sort of a rhetorical question, but it's like,
It's fun.
yeah, it's fun. It's fun. It's like it's fun, and like if you wanted to dig into more reasons, it's sort of a cultural story that we have, so that we can encourage children to like not be so afraid of the pain, that
Right.
you get some reward for it.
Right.
So, but you could still say, oh, but that story is like baloney, it's fake. So I think there's like different levels that you can interpret this. So at probably the lowest level, it would be something like the tooth fairy doesn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
But if you take it up at like another level, you could say the tooth fairy is a socially constructed game whereby children can get a small reward for, their pain, and be less likely to be averted to taking their, baby teeth out.
Mm-hmm.
But I think at the highest sense, there's another interpretation. And the interpretation has to do with, well, there is a collective story or mythology that everyone seems to play along with. And how so if I try to articulate the highest kind of interpretation of the tooth fairy story, is the tooth fairy is a narrative and embodied representation
Mm-hmm.
about how parents or guiding figures should, guide their children through loss,
Mm-hmm.
and be able to make room for new growth.
Mm. So
Um,
it's more than just a game. It's a game that people actually play.
right, and from that sense, the saying that the tooth fairy made you do it
Mm-hmm.
is accurate. Like, you could phrase it in one way. You could phrase it as they're possessed by the spirit of the tooth fairy,
Mm-hmm.
because all you did was read a story about like a benevolent tooth mother figure with wings, maybe.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, like, you know exactly how to act when your child loses your tooth. Like,
Mm-hmm.
like that's kind of magical, I think. It's kind of miraculous.
Mm-hmm.
You would think that. So I think that like demonstrates a couple of things. One is the power of narratives in terms of encoding embodied information.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and like, you can't do that with a list of rules.
No.
You can't just make a general list of rules saying, if child loses some thing or part of themselves that is painful to lose, reward them with a monetary compensation. No
Yeah.
one would follow that. But because we have a narrative representation of how to act in that circumstance, everyone can follow along, and it's as if they're being possessed by the spirit or the pattern of the tooth fairy.
Mm-hmm.
The tooth fairy being the embodiment of a benevolent and wise figure that knows how to respond to a child's loss.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's one thing that's struck me about that. And the second thing I would say is that that's one way of conceptualizing like what a spirit is.
Mm-hmm.
A spirit. So let me give you another example. So what is something that can transcend space and time? Yeah, this is a question.
What is something that can transcend space and time?
In Interstellar, they would say like love.
An idea. What, love?
Yeah.
No, true love. True love.
True love. True love.
Ideas. Thought.
Ideas. Right. How?
They exist outside of the realm of space and time.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Right, but like
So they're not.
where is that outside? Like it's very difficult to conceptualize.
Well, they're not in physical space.
Uh-huh.
They don't occupy a physical space.
Right.
Do they occupy a temporal realm? No. I don't think they're exclusive, but
Well, ideas can certainly be transmuted over time. The same ideas can be, can exist over time.
Right.
So to try to answer the question I gave you, what transcends space and time? Well, a pattern is what transcends space and time. So if you think of a pattern of, say, like music, let's say like Ed Sheeran's Shape of You, like that song.
Yeah.
That song can be encoded in, well, it can be encoded in a USB. It can be transmitted through like water particles. Like if
It's
you
in my brain right now. It's playing in my head.
Right. Or that pattern of music can be encoded within your neurons, be encoded like as like musical notation. It can be encoded as electrical signals so it can take various physical, let's say, shapes or properties, but it's all the shape of you. So in that way, it transcends space, and it can be played across any time, across any medium, and it'll still be Ed Sheeran's Shape of You. So that pattern of connections and that network is, that also includes ideas.
Right.
Those are what are able to transcend time and space. And when you make the equation between pattern or network and spirit, I think that becomes a little bit more easy to digest for the modern person. When you say the spirit of the tooth fairy is possessing you, like a materialist way to say that would be the pattern of embodied behavior as represented by the tooth fairy is being mapped onto your nervous system as you hear the narrative. So in that way, you can be possessed by spirits.
Possessed by a pattern, a story. I had fun. Go ahead.
Just to extend this even a little bit farther, I think it was Jung that believed that, let's say, the gods of like ancient Greece and Rome, they were They were like living personalities.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so they were different patterns of embodied behavior that existed, that transcended time and space. So, for example, if you take the quality of love and eros,
Mm-hmm.
if you're an ancient person living in those times, you would see that every single person, whether it's your like grandma to like your, to your pubescent like son to yourself, has that quality of like sexual desire or drive.
Mm-hmm.
And you might be like led to wonder like, what is going on here? Like, how come all these people share all these same traits, and when they are go into that mode, it seems like they're possessed. Like
Mm-hmm.
the natural like hypothesis, if you're not living in a materialist world, would be to
Mm-hmm.
say, oh, there is a common like, spirit that is
Mm-hmm.
possessing all these people across time and space.
Right.
The conceptualization of that pattern or that personality is through like the figure of Venus or Aphrodite.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so in that way, we can represent parts of our psyche as gods, as these mythical figures.
So some of these ideas are actually compatible with us, and
Uh,
some of them aren't. So I
yeah.
guess like why did the Tooth Fairy, for example, of all different stories, come out on top?
Why did that stick?
Yeah. Do you think there's maybe like biological reasons, in fact? Maybe we're so attuned to seeing such a figure as a female, for example. Like it's the Tooth Fairy is like that motherly figure, as you said before. You know, we'd imagine someone who provides for someone who's undergone pain or suffering, especially children,
Right.
as a mother figure.
Right.
We would even say it's a fairy because fairies can grant wishes, can grant people, even children, what they desire, so to say.
Yeah. I definitely do think that like I mean our biology precipitates like or permeates through everything,
Yeah.
Um, and you're right, like it has those kind of maternal qualities, like fairy magical wish granting qualities that like
Hmm.
we can immediately associate with because either because of our evolutionary history or because every human being has hopefully had a benevolent mother or a caring mother of some sort. So like there are some ways we can immediately grasp onto that story.
Hmm.
Some which are more apparent than others, and some are, that have more room for variability. But it's as if that story,
Hmm.
like, just like fits right into all the grooves and crevices of our brain,
Right.
such that it like literally sticks
Cross culturally too. Like
cross
it's
culturally.
yeah. Like I don't know if it was in Korea that do they have a similar thing? I don't know. Like I remember. Yeah. Were you gonna say that they?
I think in Korea, there is a tradition about like when you pull out your tooth, you throw it onto the roof, and then a
Crow?
a crow or
참새?
chum, yeah, a bird that I know in Korean but I don't know in English,
Yeah.
will grab it and then bring back coins or something good.
Right.
So a similar variants exist. Um, and I'm sure if we dug into it, it might be like, oh, maybe it's a mother bird, or there might be similar associations.
Mm-hmm.
But they seem to fit the grooves of our cultural and biological upbringing.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
That's powerful. And I'm sure there's people who've maybe taken like made use of that. Like I imagine like now I'm thinking back to performing again. And I think that maybe some of the most compelling performances and some of the most compelling creative pieces are
Mhm.
those which can tap into those commonly um, accepted or maybe easily, commonly, easily compatible narratives and stories and ideas.
Right.
So like a very emotional piece, for example, really hits upon those fundamental feelings and thoughts that are associated, let's say, with love or with anger or resentment or things like that.
And so, like, let's develop that to the extreme, right? So
Mhm.
you can say that some stories or experiences fit your brain groups better than and are therefore more memorable
Mhm.
and more likely to be spread. And
Right.
when you get to the stories that are the most memorable, the most unforgotten, and the most told,
Mhm.
that's what you might call an archetypal story or a religious story.
Right.
So I was thinking about this in like terms of Hamilton, the musical.
Mhm.
So Hamilton. I've been listening to the soundtrack a lot because I really love it and I'm trying to memorize it. But it occurred to me that like, the story of Hamilton, one of the reasons why it made it so compelling and popular is because it is the classic hostile brothers narrative. It's the
Mhm.
story of Cain and Abel. So like within the story, you have Alexander Hamilton who basically came from nothing and is incredibly brilliant, incredibly hardworking, and just
Mhm.
everything seems to go his way.
Mhm.
He wins the favor of sort of like the father God figure in the story is George Washington. He's literally
Right.
the father of the nation, and he yeah, George Washington grants Hamilton the status of his right hand man.
Right.
Whereas Aaron Burr, who is also very accomplished and also striving to advance in life,
Mhm.
he tried but was denied by George Washington. Um,
Mhm.
the closing lines to not closing lines, but what George Washington said to Aaron Burr was um, Burr, he lets Hamilton in while Burr was trying to speak
Right.
to George Washington, and then Washington's like, Burr, like close the door on your way out. Just get out. I got to talk to Hamilton. Um,
Right.
and so like throughout the piece, you can see the resentment building within Aaron Burr in
Mhm.
his attitude towards Hamilton. And
Mhm.
that is, I think, what's encaps. And eventually, they have a duel where Aaron Burr shoots
Yeah.
Andrew Hamilton. Spoiler
Wow.
alert! I'm sorry for people who haven't watched Hamilton. And so they kind of recreate the story of Cain and Abel, where
Wow.
Cain, due to his resentment towards Abel, who is for some reason just favored by God and seems to get his way with the world,
Mhm.
decides to murder his brother Abel.
Right.
And and of course, you can see that there's room for variation. So it wasn't a murder per se, but a
Mhm.
like a commonly agreed upon duel. Um,
Mhm.
uh, but there's elements of the story that definitely it's like a recapitulation of the original archetypal story.
Mm.
So and these archetypal stories get told in so many different forms across time for like God knows what reason, because they map well to the structure of our brain.
Interesting.
Mhm.
And Jordan Peterson, of course, takes apart
Yeah,
that
yeah.
idea.
And if you want to take that argumentation like even further, then I'm sure like Jordan Peterson has some ideas about that.
Mm-hmm.
And
Very interesting. This podcast is just a huge plug for Jordan Peterson.
yeah, yeah. But it's also me trying to relate it to like the experiences that I have and like the knowledge that I have access to, I think
Mm-hmm.
makes it mine.
Mm-hmm.
So like before I would be like uncomfortable trying to explain this because I feel like I would be parroting what I heard from his videos.
Right.
But by looking at different examples, I feel as though I have digested the content in my own way.
You've earned the wisdom.
Right, right, and I'm not just a puppet.
Mm-hmm.
That's yeah, I'm not just a parrot.
I have a question. Although, like, we're running the 2 hour mark,
Uh-huh.
there's something that I've been struggling with a lot, and I think I've mentioned this to you before as well. Is maybe it's a faith. It's a faith of ideas.
Uh-huh.
So, what is your perspective on how one should choose the wisdom that one wants to earn or one wants to assimilate? Does that make
What?
sense?
Yes, but give more of a more specific example.
Okay. Um, so the Cain and Abel idea, let's say,
Mhm.
um, you make a very compelling argument, and you see that archetype in something like Hamilton, which has been very popular, and so that gives you, some evidence to suggest that the Cain and Abel story is archetypal. Um, but why is that something that you think is true, that is valid? Why is that, for example, um, why does that supersede maybe some of the other ideas that you have, or other archetypal stories, or other beliefs that you have? Does that make sense? I don't know if I formulated that properly.
Yeah, I don't know if it's the best example to try to go off, but let's try. So so why do I favor? The question is something like, how do I know that the interpretation that I have
Mm-hmm.
is superior to or a better mode of interpretation than other interpretations?
Right. So yeah, how do you, especially in this field where it seems less about science or evidence based, or the scientific method,
Mm-hmm.
you're sort of intuiting these ideas from a broad range of evidence.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you take on the interpretation, and maybe the another interpretation might be like the Cain and Abel story is one that was established a very long time ago, and
Mm-hmm.
so people have just been telling that story over and over, so much so that it becomes archetypal, that people seem to just have just accepted this as something that is pervasive in Western culture, or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
um, how does one interpretation triumph over another?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's like another way of phrasing the question is, how do I believe in that interpretation?
Right.
How do I have faith in that interpretation? Which
Yeah.
I guess was originally how you phrased the question. Um, to address like the specifics of like that question,
Hmm.
um, so your interpretation, that it by happenstance happened to be one of the first stories
Hmm.
of humankind that happened to be recorded, and
Hmm.
so it was disseminated more widely over time, and thus became archetypal without really being, well, um, so sticky to our brains.
Hmm.
I think there's lots of ways you can make cases against that claim. Um, so one would be, again, to take like the Darwinian argument, and say an idea and patterns, or like another way to say that would be like a meme.
Hmm.
And like genes, some memes are propagated more successfully than others.
Hmm.
That might be for multiple number of reasons, because
Hmm.
it sort of maps onto our biology
Hmm.
well in some ways with our network of associations that we have, or because it provides like a better mode of being in the world that helps us better to adapt to our environments and are more likely to, the people who carry those stories are more likely to succeed. But in any case, I think the meme idea demonstrates that the stories and ideas whose truth and validity are, let's say, proven across time in the Darwinian sense, like have the most fitness, will eventually filter to the top. Like you see like a quick and dirty like process of this in like crowdsourcing or like upvoting on Reddit or even like when people, like most stories and most posts get like 0 to 1 upvotes, like and they're not very memorable. But there's some like internet memes or some formats or some stories that immediately get people's attentions first of all, and they're more likely to be remembered and shared in different forms across time. So I think that's a like pretty good argument to put against the idea that it was an arbitrary mistake, especially as you lengthen the time span. I think the likelihood of that being a matter of chance decreases because you've had more time to put it to the test of time.
Right.
Yeah.
It's like sample size in that case.
Yeah. And how do I know what I'm interpreting rises above other interpretations? And well, like what I would say to that is, I mean, in the largest sense, I don't, but in some senses I do. So what I mean by that is, I know there is always more that I'm lacking or that I have, my model of the world is slightly misconstrued. And, as an individual, you'll never be able to have a fully accurate and working model and interpretation of all the kind of knowledge and theories available in the world. But at the same time, I'm also aware of all the different models about the world I've held in the past, all the kinds of knowledge and sources of information, sources of data I've been exposed to. And like like we kind of talked about in the initial discussion about our like case study model and using our senses to cross-validate whether something is true or not, whether something is a more valid interpretation than others. Of course, we have our intellect. And we can write about and compare different models and interpretations, and that's actually a very powerful tool. But also we can try to access our memories, our emotions to a degree, and to see whether something like resonates with you.
Right.
I think also in the Darwinian sense, the fact that a story resonates with you should be an indication that the story is true. True being in the sense that it is of use to you, has greater utility than other stories. And so there are multiple ways of knowing that. And when that aligns with like your intellectual level and your intellectual history and the kind of things that you've been seeing and thinking and feeling about the world, like some ideas and interpretations just map on like really well to that. And I can see when it's mapping really well to that, because when I'm being exposed to those ideas, I'm really engaged. So like the most recent experience I think I had of that was when I was reading a book called The Systems View of Life, like on complexity theory.
Yeah.
And when I was reading through it, like it was as if like all the disparate pieces of knowledge that I've like learned before was kind of clicking into shape. So like at one point I was really interested in Salman Khan of like Khan Academy. I bought his book and he was saying the education system is built off a mechanical model of industrialization and soldier production and things like that. And and then I get into like biology and ecology and how all the things are network, and just reading that book, all those disparate pieces of knowledge seem to fall into place into one coherent picture. And the picture made sense. And like that's a weird thing we say, what do we mean when something when something makes sense to us?
When something clicks.
Something clicks. It's like it's being cross-validated by the senses that we have.
Right. Something in our brain sort of puts together all the pieces of information, and it seems to work.
And
it works.
It seems to map well to the world and to like our current models
right.
So, and some things make more sense to you than other things. And so like that sense or awareness of when things make sense to you, when things are meaningful to you, is a powerful guide to, I think, when things are true in their interpretation. And that's when we learn optimally and are so yeah. So to answer that question, how do I have faith in certain interpretations? It's firstly the intellectual level. It's also it makes sense to me, not just in like my brain, but like in my body, as weird as they sound. It makes sense. It makes sense. Yeah. And the other thing, I know you wanted to talk about like speaking truth, that as one of the footnotes, but if you try to articulate what you know and believe as truthfully as possible to other people, then you can get that same cross-validation from external sources. And so your sense of like meaning and what makes sense to you can be calibrated by that like larger social nervous system.
Right.
So you can have like the best available interpretation, let's say, and you can be confident that that interpretation at least rises above some others, even if there's a lot that we don't know.
So I think you've made a really good effort to, and when I say effort, I mean you actually succeeded in explaining and describing what it is that informs you whether or not something is truthful or something is right, essentially.
But something about that word too, like inform, like that idea or knowledge becomes a part of you. Like it can be integrated into your brain. Like something I think about the brain is that like it's like a microcosm of like the universe. So what I mean by that is there are more like connections between your neurons than the number of stars in the universe. So like this is like one of the most complex things in the universe, and when we're dreaming, like it has the ability literally to generate like different worlds. It created, and so when something informs that like internal world of yours and it makes sense, I think that's something I think it says something powerful about the validity of that interpretation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but yeah, that was a side point.
Yeah, just to finish the thought that I had, um, I was just saying that, yeah, you've made a really good, I think, a good descriptive explanatory account of what happens when you try to interpret or when you try to understand something. It might be a little unsatisfactory to say, it feels right, or it feels, but I mean, again, going back to the right brain, left brain thing, like I think there is some credit, some merit, let's say, to holistically understanding something, and realizing or recognizing that some things are right because it feels right, because the processes that are going on behind that are so complex and are so numerous, and such that we can't really identify the exact or pinpoint the exact
Uh-huh.
steps. Or, sorry, what were you saying?
Yeah, it's like when a puzzle piece, like you put that in,
Mm-hmm.
like it can kind of complete the picture if
Mm-hmm.
it's like in the context of all the other, puzzle pieces there.
Mm-hmm.
So like it kind of completes the picture or completes the network, or
Mm-hmm.
such that that image can be, or that network can be living, self-sustaining.
Mm-hmm.
That's a little bit more like of a speculative like interpretation, but
Mm-hmm. Right.
yeah.
And another thing I wanted to say was, I feel like you're taking on responsibility when you say you are trying to understand what's true and what is, yeah, what's true. Um, and the reason why I say responsibility is because I think there are times where like I've been very cynical a lot of the times, especially these past few years, and when that happens, I personally feel like I'm not taking a responsibility to commit to any idea or to
Mhm.
commit to an interpretation, and
Mhm.
that I leave it up in the air, for a number of reasons. One being, I don't feel like any of them are compelling to me.
Mhm.
Uh, Another thing is, I feel like maybe they're not right, or that there is something right that is out there that I haven't met yet. But the last thing, I think definitely what I feel is, I feel like I don't want to take the responsibility for committing to an idea
And possibly being wrong.
and possibly being wrong. Yeah.
Hmm.
So that's something I think, which I like talking to you about this kind of thing, because I feel like a lot of the times you've committed to an idea, and whether or not it's right or wrong, you commit to it. And as you keep learning, as you keep progressing, you more inform that idea, and you get a better picture, and you
Hmm.
get a higher resolution as you go along.
Hmm.
Um, and all of these, when I talk to you, all of these ideas make sense, and I think to myself, yeah, like all of those could be possibilities, but I never really think to commit to anything.
Hmm.
So I think the basis of my initial question when I asked you, why do you believe in anything, or why do you believe that something is true, comes from that sense of, is it nihilism, cynicism? Um,
Relativism.
Sorry.
Yeah, relativism.
Yeah,
Yeah.
maybe.
Hmm.
Um, this lack of faith, one
Yeah.
might call it.
Or
Yeah,
severe betrayal, sense of betrayal.
sense of betrayal.
Hmm.
What do you mean by betrayal?
Um, I think as a larger cultural pattern,
Mm-hmm.
it's like it's as though the West has been betrayed by its own creation, like
Mm-hmm.
with science and logic,
Mm-hmm.
and that analytical perspective of viewing the world and breaking down the world. Like in that process, people kind of lost faith and felt betrayed by religious stories and
Mm-hmm.
ideas and
Right.
institutes. Um, and after that, you don't know what to believe anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Or after you've been betrayed by something, you don't know who to trust anymore.
Mm-hmm.
That's a common thing that people say after they've been betrayed, right?
Right.
Perhaps it's similar to that phenomenon.
Mm-hmm.
I think um, maybe a sense of betrayal or mistrust against any one particular dominant idea.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but yeah, some ideas, some narratives have more authority, more merit than others.
Mm-hmm.
And like Descartes was like you've read the actual book. I haven't.
Yeah.
His meditations,
Yeah.
but he was trying to get to the bottom of what he can know himself that is true without the need for external validation. And his conclusion is like, I think therefore I am. Like his his thought and his consciousness was the thing that he was most sure of.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so I think when you start to like establish knowledge, you need an axiom. When you start to like have any kind of mathematical theory, for example, you need
Mm-hmm.
an axiom by which like all the other, um, let's say, stones can be laid.
Right.
Maybe the axiom, if I try to articulate it, can be something like my axiom is my consciousness and my being,
Mm-hmm.
and the idea that they these things are designed towards the pursuit of truth. Let's say that, and
Mm-hmm.
that when I have experiences that are like enlightening,
Mm-hmm.
are informing, and that make sense to me,
Mm-hmm.
that is the best possible indication that we can have that some interpretation is slightly better than another.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's the best we can have. We have nothing else.
Right.
That's maybe the axiom if I try to articulate it from like first principles perspective.
Mm-hmm. Mm.
And the social validation by other consciousnesses, beings
Mm-hmm.
within that social nervous system.
Mm-hmm. Mm. See, I can I can see that
Yeah,
happening. I can visualize it, but then it's hard for me to
yeah,
intuit. And I think a better axiom for me
yeah.
is something like, if A causes B,
Uh-huh.
then A is a reliable predictor of B.
Right.
Um, and I tend towards things, I think, that uphold that axiom. So, for example, going to the gym, you go, you work out, and you make gains.
Mm-hmm.
Very straightforward, very simple. And I can perceive that. And maybe that's sort of the reason why I'm interested in surgery now, because, you know, you make X change and you get Y outcome. And
Yeah.
it's such a simple and manageable and orderly relationship, um, that I can have faith in, right? Um, but that seems to fall apart in different aspects of my life. Um, and maybe, like, I don't know about you, if your axiom seems to work in all domains of your life. Um, I know for a fact, like, I've rarely cheated on a diet, for example, and that might be because I strongly believe, or so strongly believe, in the idea that if I do this, then this will occur.
Right.
Um, but yeah, like, I struggle with believing in a lot of faiths or religions or belief systems in general,
Mm-hmm.
if that makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, like as our conversations like progress, I think that's like our most fundamental like temperamental difference that like you tend towards order and towards you tend towards A produces B, like
Mm-hmm.
predictability,
Right.
and orderliness, whereas I prefer like the more out there
Mm-hmm.
complexity science, like, oh, A may not produce B. Depending on the circumstances and initial conditions, it might produce B times 1,000 or B times, nothing.
Right.
You can't predict it.
Well, I agree that, depending on the conditions, A affects or A predicts B in different ways. It's just I want to know what those conditions are, like I want to specify them and grapple with them.
Right.
Yeah.
But that is a very divide, and also like just because we can like articulate what our axioms are, like doesn't mean that's what they are,
That's
because
true.
that's what we say and what we have conscious awareness of is such a small portion of our psyches and how messed up we are.
Quite Freudian of you.
So Freudian, but well, yeah, I'm hoping that my perspective helped lay a tiny bit of a bridge.
Yes.
Yeah.
I feel like we're learning a lot.
Yeah, I think
Through
so.
this discussion. Yeah. So after 2 hours and a half,
Yeah.
Our first podcast episode.
Footnotes number 1.
Thank you for listening. And yeah, that's a wrap.
All right. See you next week.
Bye.